There just isn't enough interest apparently in alliums across the board that I've ever had the opportunity to do this. So when Peggy actually mentioned this as a potential topic, boy, I just jumped all over it. I mean, this is something that I'm going to enjoy. And part of the reason I've been wanting to do a presentation on alliums is because they're my favorite crops to grow. Part of the reason they're some of my favorites is because they're easy. I mean, compared to tomatoes, onions are really easy. And they don't require that you be there every other day. I mean, you can check them 3 or 4 times during the season, kind of give them a quick look, see if everything's going pretty good. You've got a good opportunity to have a good onion crop. So let's get started with this. Is your little thing not working anymore, John?
I didn't know if we wanted it or not. I'll give it to you.
Is this it?
Yeah. Okay, just a second.
While John's plugging in my little clicker thing, you know, preparing for this little discussion, I thought, well, okay, you know, is there anything interesting about alliums that maybe we don't know? So I just did a number of Google searches, and alliums are actually one of the oldest crops that we've been cultivating as far as the human species. It dates back thousands of years. They really do not know how early, but going back thousands of years, they can find evidence that those people were growing various alliums. They theorize that alliums originated in northern Africa, maybe the Middle East area. Today, there's over 600 species of alliums. Now, a lot of them are ornamentals. Anybody grown ornamental alliums? I mean, they're rather attractive, kind of interesting. But anyway, there's both ornamentals and culinary species, and within each species, there's just many, many different varieties. So we have a huge selection to choose from if we're wanting to grow alliums. How many of you enjoy eating alliums? Onions, garlic? Yeah, me too. And that's part of why I enjoy growing them, is because I really enjoy eating them. And how many of you are really good cooks? Okay, I got 1 or 2 hands. You didn't raise your hand.
I'm an eater, not a cook.
You're an eater, not a cooker. Okay, I got you. You know, alliums, they really are, particularly the onions, they're part of what is referred to as the Holy Trinity. Now, the Holy Trinity in various localities across the globe can change a little bit. You know, to me, the Holy Trinity is peppers, onions, and garlic. But generally speaking, most people are going to say it's onions, peppers, and celery. Your wife, what does she consider the Holy Trinity?
Onions, garlic, and ginger.
Onions, garlic, and ginger if you're from India. And so this does vary, but the one thing that seems consistent across the globe is onions are part of it. I mean, onions are used worldwide, and not only for culinary purposes. In some societies, they have medicinal purposes, and in some societies, they even have spiritual purposes. So the onions, alliums, garlic, or the alliums in general, onions, garlic, shallots, leeks, etc., they are very well accepted across the globe. How many of you have grown onions? Okay, how many of you have grown leeks? Good. Everybody grown shallots? A few hands. Okay, we're starting to get fewer and fewer hands. This is just a general cross-section of some of the alliums that are somewhat popular. There's others that are much less popular. I have grown all of these, and like I said, I really enjoy it. In the onion world, there's over 500 varieties, red, yellows, whites. The bulk of the use and most of what people are growing is the reds. It says about 87% of all onions grown are reds, about 87% are yellows, about 8% are reds, and then white, about 5%. How many of you grow sweet onions? Okay, storage onions. Okay, so number of hands went up on both. You know, I have the contention that you can grow a storage onion that has a flavor profile very, very close to a sweet onion. And in my opinion, storage onions are much easier to grow than sweet onions, simply because of the plant frame itself, the way the plant grows and develops. We'll get into that a little bit later. But basically what determines the difference between a sweet and a storage onion, and the term sweet is a legal term in the onion industry. You cannot have more than 5% pyruvic acid in an onion and it to be sold as a sweet onion. Now, pyruvic acid is partly genetic, it's partly weather conditions, and it's partly management practices. I can take a sweet onion, such as a yellow sweet Spanish or a candy or a delightful, Brad, and I can grow it in a way that it'll be hotter than a pistol. And I can grow it in a way that 2 hours after I've eaten it, I'm still going, that onion flavor in your mouth? And that is not a desirable flavor, is it, John? And that is basically pyruvic acid. So there's a lot of different ways that you can develop a sweet onion. I first started working with onions out in eastern Colorado in the Arkansas River Valley in 2005. This picture here shows one of the onion fields. This gentleman on any given year would grow between about 1,400 and 1,800 acres of onions. And for the most part, when I was there, we would grow between 30 and 35 varieties. None of those varieties were technically, genetically, a sweet onion. Every onion that was sold off that farm was legally sold as a sweet onion because of how he grew them and the level of pyruvic acid, which he would send the onions off for testing. The level of pyruvic acid in his onions enabled him to sell every onion off the farm legally as a sweet onion. But that's just a pretty picture, isn't it? I mean, there's not much prettier crops than onions.
So is he selling a sweet storage onion?
Pardon?
Was he selling a sweet storage onion?
He just sold them as sweet onions.
Okay.
And they would store for months. And properly grown, I'll throw this out right now, I'll probably touch on it later too, I don't know what's coming. But you know, a good onion grown properly, even a sweet onion will store for 4, 5, 6 months. A storage onion, you can probably store that for 8, 9, 10 months, if it's properly grown. So, I did have a lot of fun out in eastern Colorado, and part of what I would do out there on this particular operation, and because the gentleman had one question when I first started working with him, is, okay, what can we do to grow better onions? I want larger size. He didn't really have a lot of what would be termed jumbo onions. He had a number of onions that were in the large size, but the jumbo classification, he really had a hard time getting into that classification, and there were some potential markets he could sell into that would pay him potential dividends. So we did all kinds of research projects. This picture here, it's obviously a white onion, and I'm just showing, you can see where I've already harvested some of the onions. I put them in bags. Others, I have not bagged them up yet, but I do have them harvested, cleaned up, et cetera, et cetera. And we just did a number of research projects looking at all different types of fertility approaches, looking at biostimulants, what potential benefit would that have on different varieties of onions. And we did see some difference amongst the varieties. Some onions responded in one way, another variety would respond a little bit differently. But we learned several things. When you just go through that 3-year process, we did learn that onions responded very well to biostimulants. More so if they were direct seeded than transplanted. Everybody has seen an onion come up, right? Comes up in a little curl, which is called flag leaf, and then boom, up she comes. But it's still not even as big as a pencil lead. So direct seeding, we really saw some nice benefits from the use of biostimulants. Even in transplanting, we did see the benefits, but they were especially evident in direct seeding. Another thing that was really interesting across that 3-year period, out there in Colorado, this gentleman also grew several thousand acres of alfalfa. Well, oftentimes an onion field was right next to an alfalfa field. That's never recommended because of thrips. He also grew some grains. That's not recommended because of thrips. That alfalfa, you'll come in and you'll cut it. You'll come in and the grain will start drying down. You'll come in and take the grain crop out. Those thrips are looking for a new home. They see the onions sitting right there and they'll go, that's where I'm moving, right there. And so we were continually checking the onions for thrip populations. And we were continually spraying various insecticides. Now, back then, we were using some chemistries that, generally speaking, had a re-entry period of 3 to 5 days. We even tried some, the re-entry period was almost 30 days. I don't remember exactly, it was 26, 27 days. And regardless of what we were using, we were not eliminating the thrip pressure. We could knock it back. We could do certain things to gain a level of control, but we were never eliminating the issue. One of the things that I started noticing, and this was in like year 2, is wherever we were using overhead sprinkler irrigation, we did not have the thrip pressure. Not nearly as severe as where we were using drip or flood irrigation. So I kind of concluded, well, you know, the best thrip control was water. And it was interesting that same year, Colorado State University, who had a research station about 25 miles further up the road, they were doing thrip studies, and they came to the exact same conclusion. The best thrip control was water overhead or spraying with pressure down into the top of the plant would wash the thrips off or drown them in and amongst the leaves. So that was very, very interesting. I've never been overly concerned about thrips and onions since. The other thing that we learned was that chloride had a significant impact upon disease loss. And we started trying to study that, and it all came about basically because somebody who knew a lot more about onions than I did back then, they made the comment to me one day that onions use more chloride than phosphate. So we got together with Ray, and we were visiting, and Ray put together some plant foods with chloride as the potassium source, potassium chloride. Wherever we put that material, we saw a reduction in disease loss. And part of what we observed is that it just kept that neck area tighter. And particularly in sweet onions like candy, etc., it's a very floppy plant. It just, leaves are just flopping around everywhere. And that neck area gets very loose. And we're going to get into that a little bit more as far as disease susceptibility and the tightness of that neck. But we did see that we could develop some plant foods specifically for alliums that have had a positive effect. So talking about thrips, everyone familiar with what thrips look like? Okay, 2 or 3 hands going up. You know, thrips are going to be found. You've got these onion leaves coming up. The thrips are not going to be up here on that part of the leaf. Down here around that neck area, if you pull those leaves apart, that's where the thrips will be. They're not going to be easily visible unless you just have an outrageous infestation. They're going to be down in the neck area of that onion plant. They can cause serious economic loss. Back then, when I was in Colorado, they said on yellow onions, the economic threshold, does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say economic threshold? It's an integrated pest management term that if I'm under this number of pests per plant, it's not going to provide economic benefits to spray an insecticide or a control agent. Back then, the economic threshold on yellow onions, according to the Colorado State University, was about 110 per plant. White onions, it went all the way down to about 40 to 50. Red onions, 15 to 20 per plant. You could suffer economic damage. So the yellow onions are not nearly as susceptible to thrip damage as the whites and the reds. One of the major concerns that I have had down through the years, I haven't seen very much of it. I saw a couple instances of it in Colorado, but not many. Thrips can vector some viral diseases, particularly iris yellow spot leaf virus, and that will kill your onions. That's very damaging. So I do recommend we scout for thrips. I do recommend that we observe our crop, and if we start seeing issues, then of course we will take control measures. I kind of mentioned today earlier when I was talking about biostimulants, I'm not real fond of pesticides. Some of the control measures that you might want to try before you go into a harsh insecticide is you might want to try the water. There's a lot of research out there, though, that if the water's not giving you the control, plant oils, such as what's found in Drago, is very effective against thrips. And that's pretty much a natural control measure that somebody could go with and still expect a very respectable level of control. If you do have to go to chemistries, the neonicotinoids, ivermectin type materials are effective on thrips. They were just starting to develop some of these bacterial products, the Entrust Success Radiant, that the bacteria in those products actually basically infect or they kill the thrips. They're using them as a food source. So there are a number of ways to control thrips. As I said earlier, it's best not to grow onions close to grains or alfalfa or some of your other grass crops. They will move. That right there is probably one of my top 5 favorite pictures that I've ever taken. It's just bags of onions sitting in the field. But I obviously took it at sunset. It's got a nice gold color to it. And you can see that it's very hilly out in the Arkansas River Valley. It's almost like a tabletop, isn't it? But, what they would do out there, and this gentleman had, generally speaking, about 190 to 200, 210 laborers on the farm during the season, and they would come out, and when the onions were ready to be harvested, they would pull them, leave them in the field to cure for several days. Then they would come back in, top them, cut the roots off, put them in bags. Then the next thing is trucks would come through the fields. They would pick the bags up, dump them on a conveyor, which would dump them into the truck. Then they would take it in for a final curing. But I just love that picture. So I have actually included it several times in this presentation. Once I left Colorado, I moved out toward Indiana. I was still very intrigued with onions as a crop. So this is a project that I did in east central Indiana, Wayne County, in Indiana. In this particular project, I included 44 different varieties. I had 3 replications per variety. Each plot was 72 onions. So I had a lot of onions out there. Some of the things that we looked at was we studied population. Where could we expect maximum production per square footage or per acre, whether it be 2 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the things that we did find out, in addition to population, spacing, was that variety selection is really important wherever you're growing onions. Up here in the northern part of the U.S., we want to grow long day onions, which requires about 14 to 15 hours of daylight, which will initiate bulbing. Or we can do really well with a lot of the intermediate day onions, 10 to 12 hours of daylight before they start the bulbing process. What we do not want to grow up here in our part of the country is short day onions. Those are for down south. And the reason is because they will start bulbing way too early in the season. We're not going to get the eventual bulb size that we're wanting. So variety selection is really, really important. What we found studying population, that 4 lines per bed, and you can see we were growing them on plastic mulch. 4 lines per bed, 5 to 6 inch spacing, and I think we were at 5 inch spacing on those beds. That gave us the highest yield. We tried some at 4 inches per line, and I use the term line. What I'm talking about is 1, 2, 3, 4 lines per bed. Going to 4 inches per in the line, that actually reduced the yield. I think probably a little bit from competition, plus we just we're crowding the onions a little bit for when the bulb is actually starting to size up. So we did not really see a strong benefit from putting them closer together in the lines. We did find that it was very important that we run 2 drip lines per bed. This was true if I had 3 lines per bed or if I had 4 lines per bed. If I had 2 lines per bed, then I could get by with 1. But if I go to 3 or 4 lines per bed, it really paid dividends to run 2 drip lines per bed. And I think that kind of makes sense when we're looking at water soak out, because we're using the drip lines as the nutrient delivery system. We did not see any benefit. We didn't really study this intensely. We did not see a strong benefit as far as center of the bed to center of the bed. That's going to be more a standpoint of how much room do you have, what kind of equipment do you have to go in and get the onions picked up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like we could have probably had a couple of feet between the beds and still been in pretty good shape. I think in that particular project we were looking at 5-foot centers. But it did become obvious that somewhat of a raised bed is beneficial. Part of it is it just reduces the susceptibility of potential issues such as pink root, basal plate rot, things like this. It just kept that overall growing and rooting environment a little bit on the drier side than, say, if it had been a flat growing area. We did find that onions, and I found this in several other projects, onions and garlics, they are actually fairly weed tolerant unless you're direct seeding. If you're direct seeding, then the weeds can really, really hurt you. If you're transplanting, not so much in this project, although to a certain degree, but I've had several other projects down through the years where I literally could not see the onions. I could not see the garlic because of all the weeds, and still harvested a very respectable crop. Not the best crop I've ever harvested, but a very respectable crop. So alliums are somewhat weed tolerant. This just shows one of the plots from that project. You can see the particular variety there is Candy, which is one of my least favorite onions. But I get a lot of arguments on that. So I will say it's got a sexy name, Candy. And Brad, as good a name as Delightful is, it's not as good as Candy. So, but this is showing one of the plots. What I would do when I would harvest a plot, and I do this with all of my projects, whether it be alliums, whether it be tomatoes, peppers, whatever, I look at every single produce. I look at every single fruiting form, the bulb on the alliums. I check it, is it marketable? Have we got any issues here that is going to make this an unmarketable onion? Maybe I could take it to the kitchen that day, but I can't sell it because it's not going to have any shelf life. You can see in this particular little plot here, those 2 onions that are down on the ground off the plastic, those had some disease issues. So I started out pretty good in this plot. Most of them were okay. And you can see I've topped them. I've cut the roots off. So this just shows a graph that the results, this is pounds of onions per 3 plots. So it'd be pounds of onions. If you wanted to know the individual bulb weight, you'd have to divide that by about, 216, something like that. The largest onion was a variety called the Lisa Craig, very common in Great Britain. And it grew some huge onions. You can see from variety to variety that there was quite a variance. So that's part of why I say variety selection when growing onions is really important. That you pick an onion that's going to do well in your unique situation. Generally speaking, the Candy did pretty good. The Delgado, Expression, Sedona down there did really well. And what we're looking at here is the gold is the yellow onions, the blue are the white varieties, and the red, of course, is the red varieties. The little black section up above the tops of these bars, that's the percentage or weight of onions that were not marketable. They were already showing disease issues at harvest. So you can see there's quite a variance there as well. I put all those onions in storage bags, came back 30 days later, or approximately 30 days later, and the pink now is what had gone bad after 30 days. You can see Lisa Craig, which had the highest yield at harvest, man, I don't have hardly anything left. So that's not what we're wanting to see, is an onion that's going to be susceptible to disease. Some of the other varieties, you can see very little loss after sitting in those storage bags for 30 days. Well, then I came in 30 days later. And the yellow is now what was lost in the first 30 days. The pink is again what was lost in the most recent 30 days. So you can see there's quite a variance between what was originally harvested and what actually was marketable. So again, the point I'm trying to show there is that variety selection is important. Find a variety that's going to be very suitable for your requirements and your environment. So, again, onion size is important. I think most of you guys that I work with here in South Dakota, actually I don't work with you, that Ray works with you and John's going to be working with you. You guys do like a big onion. I work a lot in the Amish markets, and they have the philosophy, the bigger the better. I mean, this last season was a great onion year. We had a lot of onions that were 2 pounds and heavier, and they just loved it. In the overall onion market in the United States, that has almost no marketability. You go into a grocery store and they want an onion like this, maybe the size of a baseball. And that always puzzled me until one day my son, who lives on the outskirts of Chicago, he said, Dad, he said, I don't want any more produce. He said, just quit dropping produce off here. And I said, well, okay, how come? And he said, when I prepare a meal, he said, I want to consume that commodity, whatever it is, that meal. I don't want to put anything in the refrigerator. And he said, you're just bringing me way too big of stuff. And so if you're growing onions into a market that's going to be, say, like the Walmart market, you don't want this. You want a selective variety that's going to give you a nice baseball-sized onion, one that's going to store well, one that's got good flavor, and you can sell onions all day long. But in our current client base, we do like big onions. Fertility is going to impact susceptibility to disease. I touched on that earlier when we were doing some of those research projects looking at potassium chloride as the potassium source versus potassium nitrate and things like this. Variety selection is also important for disease susceptibility. And as I said, also to meet your individual market demands. And do you want a sweet onion? Then choose a sweet variety. If you like an onion that's going to have a nice full onion flavor, but not be overly pungent, then I would probably recommend a storage variety and grow it properly. So, and you going for fresh market or extended market? I mean, all of these are questions that's going to determine variety selection, really, more than any other thing. Some of my favorite onions, Bradley, which is a 118-day onion. Delgado is a 118-day onion. I will tell you right now, there is no Delgado onion seed available this year if you haven't already bought it. Sedona is a really good variety. As a matter, and all of those are storage onions. They're technically not sweet, but I have got a lot of my Amish communities that are growing the Delgado, the Bradley, and they actually prefer it to a candy onion just because of the flavor profiles. And they're grown in a way that does not give you a high level of pyruvic acid. Safrain, I like that one pretty well, but I don't like it as well as the top three. For sweet onions, I've had really good experience with Candy, Expression, and a new variety from Rupp Seed, which they've named Delightful. And it was a delight to watch it grow. I mean, it was a very nice onion, which I'll show you some data. If you're wanting to grow a red onion, by far, in my experience, by far and away, the best red onion is an SV4643. Brad, I think you guys have that? Yeah. That is just an incredible red onion. I mean, that will size up to a size that's very impressive, and even more impressive is when you cut into that, it's just eye candy. The deep red coloration between every ring, and then the whiteness of the ring. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous onion. Stores incredibly well, and it has very good flavor profiles. For a white onion, the best one I've grown to date is a variety called White Wing. It's got a little more disease susceptibility than, say, the top four or SV4643, but you can still get a very respectable crop out of it. And you can see those are all long to intermediate day onions. You can start onions from seed. You can direct seed if you so desire. I don't choose to do that. I choose to grow transplants. And generally speaking, I don't actually start any of my own transplants. I have a young Amish fellow down in northern Indiana, a very good friend of mine. He starts all of my plants because starting plants or seed for transplanting requires a lot of time. You got to be there, and I'm just not there. So I have him start all of my stuff. Generally speaking, he will either take an open tray and just start sifting seeds in there. I mean, they are thick in there. And once they come up and they're past flag leaf, he'll dig them out with a little fork, and then he'll put them into a 288 for me. And when I say a 288, I think everyone knows I'm talking about 288 cells in this tray. I don't go to big cells. I expect them to stay fairly small. I highly recommend a rooting stimulant. I highly recommend a silicate material. That's going to give a potential transplant that's got good thickness, it's got good above ground, really sturdy above ground plant parts, and it's going to give me a very nice aggressive root system below ground. I don't use a lot of fertility when I'm starting the transplants. We do a little bit of 17-4-17 or something along those lines, but it's not a lot. I usually plan on no more than 4 to 5 weeks from seeding to transplanting. Now, any of you that have done this, 4 to 5 weeks, that's not going to give me an onion transplant that will pull completely out of the cell. I'm liable to have a little bit of the growing medium still left in the cell, and that's fine with me. I guarantee you can take an onion transplant, throw it on that tabletop right there, and it's going to grow. It's going to look a little funky, but they're very sturdy little transplants. But I like my transplants to be about yay tall, and that's about it. And the Amish, they trim the tops continually. And I tell the young man that does mine, don't you even think about trimming my tops off. Why? Because 2 reasons. One is it opens up a pathway for water to get down into that neck area so I can have potential disease issues. And secondly, and John talks a lot about this, I'm going to touch on it tomorrow, every plant is an energy collection factory. It's an energy conversion factory. Why do I want to cut 2/3 of my ability to capture solar energy off? I don't care if it's a little tall. I don't care if it's a little floppy. I do not want to cut any of my capability to capture solar energy. I do not want to cut that off. So I do not trim mine. If you choose to trim yours, that works better for you, go ahead and do it. I mean, a lot of guys are highly successful with it. This one is really important. When transplanting, do not transplant them too deep. About 1 inch is the preferred depth. You don't really want to lay it on the tabletop like I was saying, but you don't want to plant it down there that deep either. And the reason is that onion bulb, what that is, that's a modified stem. It is not part of the root, it's a modified stem, and as that bulb starts to swell, particularly if you have heavier ground, it's just more and more pressure against that onion bulb. You really want about 1/3 of that bulb to be below the ground level, and about 2/3, really, frankly, above the ground. And that will allow that bulb to really develop into a nice globe shape. Once I transplant my onions, it is a race. An onion, I think everybody knows this, I mean, the size of the onion bulb is going to be, to a large degree, dependent upon how many rings you get. Every leaf is going to give you 1 ring in that bulb. So it is a race to go from transplanting to when I start seeing initial bulbing. I want all the potential leaves I can get. I do not know if this is true, but they say most varieties of onions have the potential for about 13 leaves. I've never counted. I don't know. Am I going to do it this next season? Oh, you bet. And I've got to even keep tracks of the little brown ones that dried up, John. Are barely visible anymore. But it is a race. We want to go into a highly aggressive vegetative frame of mind or mode of activity when I transplant my onions. I'm going to be looking across the season and putting around 140 to 160 units of nitrogen down, about 80 units of phosphate, about 140 units of potash. Sulfur is also really important in onion production. It helps with reducing disease susceptibility. A lot of the flavor profiles that we enjoy when eating an onion, those are all sulfur compounds. Calcium is extremely important, particularly in the last half of the season, although I also add some early in the season. That's going to give us cell stability. It's going to give us bulb density. It's going to be a nice hard onion, one that's going to store really, really well. Of course, I like the chloride for the reasons I've already mentioned. It helps with disease control. Also, really important in onion production is boron, zinc, manganese, molybdenum. All of these are going to significantly impact the yield potential of that onion crop. I apply about 30% of the nitrogen pre-plant. I made the comment I'm targeting 140 to 160 units, so I'm taking about 30% of that, and I'm putting it down pre-plant. Generally speaking, I'm going to use ammonium sulfate because I want that sulfur in there really early in the season. I'm going to put down about 50 to 80% of the phosphate and about half of my potash requirement. And I'll probably look at, okay, what kind of cheap, fairly cheap, reasonable price potash source. But the one thing that is really critical is the ammonium sulfate, in my opinion. I want a lot of sulfur going into my onions, but I want all of the sulfur in the first half of the season. I don't want any sulfur in the last half of the season. And generally speaking, what we do, I say I'm going to push nitrogen at least every 2 to 3 weeks. We're running nitrogen with every single fertigation for basically the first 2 months. We keep water availability on the high side. I don't want it to be soupy mud, but I do not want that to get anywhere close to dry. Onions use a lot of water. A lot of water. So I'm going to fertigate my calcium. I'm going to fertigate potassium. I'm going to fertigate trace minerals basically every time I water. That's part of what I like about growing onions on a drip system. It's a beautiful, beautiful, easy nutrient application method. So, and I said there, most varieties have potential of 12 to 13 leaves. I don't know that, but I am going to check that this year.
I've had some as high as 16 and 18.
Okay, that's good to know. That gave you a nice bulb, didn't it?
Sure did.
This gentleman said he's had some onions with 16 to 18 leaves. That's going to give you a huge bulb. You know, I don't see any reason why an onion has a genetic ceiling of leaves. It's not like a corn plant. But Brad, do you know anything on that?
I've always heard 13 leaves, but, you know, just like corn, you know, the start is probably the most important part. The potential probably for leaves and for growth that are established in the first few weeks of growth.
Yeah. Well, like I said, we are going to check that out just a little bit. This is my theory. I haven't read anything, but as I'm observing my onions, when I first transplant them for the first 30 days or so, maybe the first 45, 50 days, they grow pretty much like a green onion. Just, you know, pretty much straight up and down neck area. I reach a point, generally speaking, probably closer to 45 days than 30 days, where that neck area will do this, or the bottom of that stem, where the bulb's going to be, it'll go whoop, it'll just push out just a little bit. And then it grows proportionately again for about another 30 days. Once you get that initial little whoop bulb swell, that tells you you've got about 3 weeks to get this crop pretty well finished off as far as nitrogen goes. I mentioned I want all the sulfur in the first half of the season. I want all the nitrogen really in the first half of the season. As I said earlier, it is an all-out race with onions. And pretty much all of the alliums. If we start seeing some leaf tips turning yellow, turning brownish in color, generally speaking, that's the onion plant telling you, you did not give me enough nitrogen. I'm starting to suck nitrogen out of an older leaf and moving it to newer leaves. So that's a visual symptom that you can look for. The leaf tips should be green throughout the season until we start getting into dry down or maturation. As I do say there, when you're transplanting, let's say you got 3 or 4 leaves. Chances are none of those will be there at harvest. They do start taking some of those older leaves and sucking them back into the plant. So that's not what I'm concerned about. It's the larger leaves like this. When we start seeing those degrade, then we know we got a issue. As I say there, once bulb swell becomes noticeable, I said it goes whoop, and then it will do that for 30 more days, and then you'll really start to see that bulb start to swell and develop. No more nitrogen. You're done. And I say that now, I'm going to say something just the opposite. If your leaf tips are starting to turn yellow, you can come in with a little tiny touch-up of nitrogen just to try and keep that green another week or 2 longer, but no more big applications. We're done. Putting nitrogen on late onto an onion crop, you're going to grow a crop that's going to taste bad, it's going to have a high level of disease susceptibility, and it's going to be soft and it's not going to store. And none of those characteristics are what we're looking for in an onion. So once about 50% bulb size, and you can start telling that, the leaves will start to tell you, you'll start to see the tips will start to brown. You'll start to see yellowing from the top of the plant down. You can start cutting the water back. We don't want the onions to wilt, but we do want to start cutting that water back and starting to dry up, semi-dry up that root zone. I really like, and I use 41838 and 52525 throughout the season, but if you haven't been using 52525, I really like it on that last 60 days. And you can see I'm alternating that particular nutrient source with calcium. And the reason is because, again, that's going to give me, I want an onion bulb that if I throw it at you, it's just like I threw a rock at you. I mean, I want it to hurt. And that's what calcium will give you. So, the primary enemy or the challenge we face when growing onions is weather. That's where most of our disease issues are going to come about. That can be in the form of rain. It can be in the form of really heavy dews for an extended period of time. It can even come about in the form of high humidity for an extended period of time. Moisture is the enemy of onions once they're starting to get close to maturation. As I said, early in the season, we want to keep them relatively moist. We want a lot of water availability there. Some of the common onion diseases, we have botrytis, leaf blight, we have purple blotch, downy mildew, onion smut. I don't see a lot of those. Probably the one I see most commonly would be the botrytis, leaf blight, or the purple blotch. And I see that probably half a dozen times a season. I don't ever see downy mildew. I have never seen onion smut. But they say that's fairly common in some areas. I do see pink root every now and then, but not a lot. I used to see some basal plate rot out in Colorado. I really don't see it out here in our part of the world. Now these next 4, neck rot, botrytis, slippery skin, sour skin, black mold, I do see those. And all of those are basically caused by dirt splash and or humidity. And when I say dirt splash, I'm talking about we have this onion sitting there like this. This is the neck area. And we get a rain event. A raindrop comes down, hits right here. Has any of you ever seen an enlarged photograph or a slow motion video of a raindrop hitting something, what does it look like? It just explodes. It goes, phew, and here we go. Picks up a little bit of soil, a little bit of dirt, whatever you want to call it, gets into that neck area, and I mean, here we go. That's where a lot of these diseases initiate, is in dirt splash. So the tighter that we can keep that neck, that raindrop coming down, hitting that plastic, exploding up into the air, comes down on that onion neck, that neck's still tight and it just rolls off. And we really, really limit disease susceptibility. So here's some pictures. I did not include the most common diseases that I see, because whether it's sour skin, whether it's neck rot, whether it's slippery skin, to a very large degree, and the early stages of infection, it still looks like an onion. There's nothing wrong with it outside of you squeeze it and moisture will come up out of the neck area, etc. But this right here on the upper left is botrytis leaf blight. A lot of people mistake that for thrip damage. As long as that is kept under some level of control, it's not going to have a significant impact upon your yield or your production. And frankly, I don't see a lot of that. I see that several, like I said, 4 or 5 times a year maybe. Purple blotch, alternaria. Yeah, Raymond.
So is the botrytis vectored by thrips, or is it soil-borne?
It's basically a soil-borne there in this case. And I've never seen the top picture on the bulb. I've never seen that level of damage, ever, from botrytis. I do see a little bit of powdery mildew, which is the bottom right-hand photograph. Generally speaking, that's environmental. If the environment dries up a little bit, becomes a little less humid, that will tend to go away, and somewhat the same thing on downy. I included the picture of onion smut just simply because I found it interesting. I've never seen it. Now I want to see it. So any of you will want to volunteer to grow onions and have onion smut, I'll find the pathogen and bring it to you. There's my picture again. I just love that picture, as I said earlier. You know, the point is, we've done a lot of variety projects. We've done a lot of fertility projects on onions down through the years. We've probably done more onion projects than any other commodity outside of maybe tomatoes. But you know, we do a lot of projects. This is a leek project. And I'm going to go through some of the other alliums here. You know, what I read about leeks, and in my opinion it's true, it's probably the single most flavorful allium there is. It's just got a beautiful flavor. It tastes a little bit like a mild onion, but it's got some uniqueness also. From a market standpoint, this is the second most valuable allium you can grow. And how many of you have seen leeks in the grocery store? Okay. One thing, I mean, those of you that know me well know I can get excited. Not in a positive way. It's also called complaining. And you want to see me complain, if I see leeks in a grocery store and they have a white neck, yeah, Raymond, okay, 3 or 4 inches long, that's irritating to me because there's no reason to grow such a poor quality leek. You need, because the white is the only part that you can really eat. I think you could take the green part and cook that, boil that for probably 6 months and it still wouldn't be edible. Could be wrong there. But you can see we've done some variety work on leeks. This is from a project back in 2021. We were actually comparing our organic production program to what would be considered a conventional production program compared to what would be our biological control program. I will say this and the shallots both, the guy whose farm I was on, he gave me a little bit of iron toxicity as he was doing some weeding. And he really impacted some of the full biological programs. I will say this about leeks. Any of you that have grown leeks know you can't pull them. This is a crop you have to dig. They're all long season. You're going to be digging them probably in November up here. But it's definitely worth growing. Shallots. Pound for pound, this is the highest value allium there is by far. Particularly if you're going into some of the gourmet varieties. The French gray is considered the ultimate from a culinary standpoint. This picture here is showing Dutch red. Both French gray and Dutch red you can save the same way you do garlic and replant year after year after year. You can see this is just a little biostimulant study that I was doing. We picked up a very nice yield increase with using a biostimulant on the shallots. This is some commercial varieties of shallots, and you can see again the iron toxicity on the bio column. I started to leave that out, and I said, no, it is what it is. I mean, I know what happened, but you can see even our organic program significantly out-yielded the conventional program. Garlic, I've done a lot of garlic projects. The largest project I did included 96 varieties. Some of my favorite varieties are Rosewood, Georgia Crystal is a beautiful garlic, German Stiffneck, very, very dependable. Music is very dependable. I still like Carpathian. I like Chestnut Red because it's a very dependable variety, and it's a variety that responds really well out here in South Dakota. Soft necks, California Early, Silver White are really good varieties to consider. I'm going to go through this, but you can see some of the same things. We saw a significant improvement in yield, reduction in disease loss, etc., from the 3 fertility treatments there on the bottom. 91.6 of the our conventional program was marketable. The control, 80%. On the organic, it was 83%. So we did see some nice improvements. This was an onion project this last year. And we had pretty good growing weather until the last several weeks. Maybe the last month, we had a couple of storms come through. And as I said, one of the issues with candy is a somewhat loose neck, but it was included in the project. This candy replacement is now called Delightful. And as far as the sweet onions, you can see the expression was the highest yielder, but right behind it was Delightful. Candy was below that, and yellow sweet Spanish was below that. You can see the SV4643, the yield data on that yielded really, really well. Bradley did well, which is a storage onion. We did not have Delgado in this trial simply because I didn't have the seed. So, getting into, and I'm going to run over a couple of minutes here. Once we've grown our onions, once about 40 to 50% of the tops have started falling over, and y'all know what I'm talking about, the onion top will fall. Depending on your market, if you take a few onions to market, then you go back the next week, you're taking more, well, you can dig them as they fall and get ready. If you want to harvest your onions, get it done, then once about 40 to 60% of the tops have fallen, go in and roll them, or you can come along with your foot and just break the rest of them over. And then let them sit there for about 5-6 days, maybe a week. A lot of the nutrient, the energy that's in that top will still go down to the bulb. Look at your weather forecast. Do not harvest onions if the next week is rainy and humid. Do not harvest them. They'll be better off just staying right there in the ground. But if you have some pretty nice weather, I personally, the way I do it, you don't have to do it this way, I pull the onions up, I lay them on the ground, and I like the sun to sit there for another couple of days, continuing to cure those onions. Then I will come in and I'll cut the top. I cut the root. I do not want a lot of vegetative mass going into my drying area. If I take all the tops, I've got to dry that out now too. And again, as I said, moisture is by far the biggest enemy you have in curing onions. I mean, if you can't get some dry weather and some dry wind blowing across those onions, you're going to have a very difficult time curing them properly. So watch the weather forecast. Garlic, about 30% of the top's brown. Go ahead and take it out. It's pretty well done. Shallots, similar to the onions. Leeks, you can leave those all winter long if you want. Storage, basically a warm to cool. Temperature's not extremely important. You do want it to be a dry area. And you would like a little airflow through there wherever you're storing your onions. It's not essential, but it's recommended. Avoid hot, freezing temperatures. Avoid water again at all cost. Water is just an incredibly bad input into onions once you're trying to cure them and store them. So with that, I think we're done. Appreciate it.